Well, welcome back to another episode of the ADOS Empowered Community podcast. I am your host, Joel Adcock. I'm Director of Strategic Partnerships at Rev and the Executive Director of the United ADOS Collective. Glad to have everybody with us today. I've got a special guest and great friend, Darren Sodoski. Darren is co-founder of National Calibrations and Diagnostics out of North Carolina, and also the CIO of ProMobile and Scan, which is a mobile sublet company in North Carolina as well. Darren is very well respected within the industry in terms of his knowledge on all things ADAS, diagnostics, really anything that's coming into view as far as the vehicle technology continues to expand. And really excited to kind of dive into a topic that I know Darren is very well abreast on, and excited to kind of talk a little bit about some of the industry dynamics that he's seeing on his side as well. So, Darren, without further ado, thank you and appreciate you taking some time with us today.
Joel, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me and looking forward to the discussion today.
Awesome, man. So you and I met roughly 2 years ago. Through course of conversation, we've gotten to have, I think, a pretty good relationship when it comes to a level of understanding of where we're at, I think, in the industry as it currently sits. Your journey has been kind of unique getting us to this particular point. I think when folks meet you, they realize that you are, again, very well versed on a lot of the OEM dynamics when it comes to, and I mean that pun intended, with vehicle technology, with understanding where that opportunity exists on the ADAS side. But maybe walk us back through where you got your start on really the automotive journey for yourself, sir.
Sure. So I think, like a lot of people in the ADAS industry or diagnostic industry, I was around the collision industry to start. So my family was in the collision business since before I was born. So I was very young around the shops, helping prep bumper covers or whatever it was from a very young age. So that's really where my first experience with the industry came from. And then I got interested in technology, and so that's still a hobby of mine and a good pastime for me. And then sort of as I was exiting, schooling and starting to become a young adult, ADOS and diagnostics started to come onto the scene. And so I was very fortunate that I was in the right place at the right time. We had a segment of an industry that I had background and experience in that I had been around my entire life. And then it also combined the area of work that I thought I was going to go into. I wasn't originally going to go into the automotive industry. I was going to go into the IT and networking space. And my dad found this part of the industry, and he's like, maybe you should check this out. So all roads lead back to collision, right? When you're born into it, you kind of stay into it sometimes.
Hard
But
to get away from you.
it can be. And so I found, ADOS and diagnostics, and it was a perfect blend of the route I wanted to go with my career while also combining background and experience that I already had. So that's my background. I feel like the luckiest person alive to where I found an industry where I was able to capitalize on not only the right time, but also the right experience to be successful in this industry.
Yeah, yeah. Once you kind of get into the industry, it's tough to get away from to some degree, which I think is great. Obviously, we need people that have got that ambition, sort of that pride of duty, the things that they've learned through the early journeys. I know myself when I started, 15 years ago, I never anticipated being in the industry this long, but it's sort of turned into like this passion of sorts where you're certainly in a position to put cars back on the road that are safe and having that experience on the collision side and working your way up through into that area where it's understanding the vehicle complexities and technology, continuing to see that evolve, obviously, I think is something that's it's really encouraging to see. And I think for a lot of folks that are listening out there, it's something that if you're considering, a pathway into like the ADAS side, you're a good example of like having that foundational collision experience first, and then obviously, like you say, moving into sort of that diagnostic side and ADAS side. Where did you kind of have that aha moment? Like, what was that maybe that one vehicle or that one opportunity that really kind of said, this is exactly what I know what I want to do for the rest of my life, basically.
Yeah, I think for me, once I realized that vehicles in the modern age are just computers on wheels and they're diagnostic networks on wheels, I think that's really when I got very interested in what I'm doing now. Um, One of the things that I did that I encourage a lot of people to do when they're either getting into the industry or exploring if this is a career that's right for them is I just started reading OE service info. And it's not exciting, for the most part. It's not a novel that you want to sit on the beach and enjoy on vacation. But what it helped me to do, at least, and I think what it can help others to do, is understand how are these systems put together? How do they function? How do they diagnose the network, the issues that can pop up? And that's really when I started to realize that my background with networking and computers, which I am a big nerd about, I can apply that to vehicles. And I love vehicles too. I'm a car guy. So that's really when I figured out I can combine two of my passions into a career path. And that's really when, the roots started to take hold and I saw a long-term future.
Yeah, we that understanding of like OEM service information, I think, is an underserved opportunity that a lot of folks just don't take the time to like you say, they're not going to spend uh, free time, so to speak, like reviewing it. So being able to do that, you're actually one of a few people that I know that have actually enjoyed going through like a lot of the OEM service information. That's one of the things that we wanted to chat a little bit about is as you've kind of immersed yourself in understandings of like where the OEMs, you've actually developed a laptop that harnesses a lot of the OEM information for programming and diagnostics right onto a single source of hardware, basically, which I want to dive into here in a little bit as well. But thinking about like we hear a lot of, there's lack of standards between OEMs. There's, why does one OEM call this ADAS system this and another one calls it's the same type of system but something different. There's, lack of standards. There's gray area. Do you have any kind of insight into like what your thoughts are, opinion as far as like why is there such a difference between one vehicle manufacturer when it comes to these systems? And like, what's that mindset, do you think, as far as the automakers are, as far as, why are they creating technology that maybe is a little bit too far advanced at this particular point for a lot of shops to be able to harness? And be curious what your thoughts are in that regard.
Yeah, so that question makes me think about how do manufacturers market just vehicles, right? Even before ADAS came onto the scene, right? And so a lot of people know about Honda VTEC, right? Variable valve timing. And each manufacturer, if they have that technology, they all call it something different. So this is not something that's new for our industry. That's something that we're used to. And I think it comes down to the fact that there really are no industry standards at this time that bring unilateral naming to all these different systems. The other portion of that has been is, when ADOS was in its infancy and manufacturers started to implement these systems in different ways, some of them would have just emergency braking and it was radar based only. Another one would have emergency braking plus adaptive cruise and maybe it used a fusion system where it used both a windshield camera and a radar. So I think that's part of it too. The way that these systems are implemented across manufacturers is not uniform either. So that's obviously something that I think our industry will eventually come to terms on, and we'll have standardized naming sets or categorization of what systems are powered by what sensors and what functions do they serve. And I think we're starting to see that with some of the regulations that are being released.
Mhm.
But that's my guess as to where that will head and how it started there to begin with.
Do you think that the technology at this particular point, like there were some new things that came out at CES event, conference a couple months ago at Vegas, pretty crazy technology. You start thinking about like thermal imaging, and that's just one example, like being able to see out in front of like the actual displacement of the headlights. It can actually pick up objects, whether it's a human or animal or something like that. And then I think of like where certain shops are at this particular point in their ADOS journey, and Um, is it how would you recommend a shop go about like trying to stay up on top of all this information? I mean, without spending a weekend at the beach, as you say, like reading OEM service information, like what's a good rule of thumb as far as like how to stay on top of all of this? Because it's moving so fast. I know that's cliche and it's talked about on just about every webinar or podcast or anywhere you go. It's like, well, how do the shops that really haven't begun that journey, like where would you recommend they start?
Sure. So there really is no clear-cut answer or path as to here's exactly how you stay ahead of the curve in the industry, right? But if we think about this in terms of how do other industries or other, occupations in the world stay up to date? So if you were a doctor, right, you might continue to read medical journals or, information that's been released. If you were a mathematician, you would continue to read the theses that get released. Whatever industry you're in, on those levels, there's usually some sort of documentation. We're fortunate that in our industry, there is documentation through the manufacturer service info. Is it as complete as a doctoral thesis? No, it's probably not.
Right.
But at the same time, that's one of the best ways I've found, at least, to stay ahead of the curve, is especially when I see a manufacturer that's releasing a new vehicle line. I want to go to the service docs and read through some of those system descriptions to understand how is this working. So if you go for a emergency braking system on a vehicle and you go into the system description and component description, it will tell you all of the pieces of that system that are going to interact with each other. And one of the trends that I've noticed is that typically the EV vehicles in our industry, those tend to have more technology packed into them. So what I would do is I would go into those EV models that are coming out and take a look at, okay, with all these features that are in here. So for the EV models that are coming out that tend to have those new systems, especially if there's a system that we haven't seen before, that's what I want to go and read. So a good example of that is Volvo introduced some LiDAR technology
Mhm.
that had a lot of controversy in the industry because if you pointed a phone camera at it, it had such a high intensity
Mm.
that it would then burn the camera sensor or the lens on an iPhone. So that obviously was a heads up to everybody in the industry. Hey, there's a new piece of technology that's coming out. That's really the best way that I've found. One of the other things that I did when I first got into the industry, my business partner Cliff was also former business partners with someone who was a nuclear engineer. So he knew where to find, the documents for how these systems were designed, the papers on, the research teams that developed these. So I read through all of those engineering documents on radars and cameras and 360 and sonar. So that helped me a lot, just understanding on both a scientific level and physical level, how are these systems actually designed and implemented?
Mhm.
Um, that was that was a huge help to me. If anybody else were to read those, they would probably fall asleep. They're extremely boring and very, very scientific. But to me, I had to understand how does this technology work so that I can understand better how to repair it.
It seems like that's a big discrepancy right now on, uh, and you could probably even speak to this as far as from what you've seen working with shops as you work through helping source equipment for them is their intention is, well, we want to buy equipment so that we can do work in-house and do calibrations, and it's, they're assuming it's plug and play, right? They plug in their tablet and off they go with all the information right there as far as like what they need to do. There's a gap on the actual understanding, like you mentioned, of like how an actual camera works, or how a LiDAR works, or how radar actually works, or how these sensors are starting to sort of fuse together so that they're working interdependently, and sort of backups to each other. And I think, in your opinion on this too, do you feel like that's a shortcoming of shops in terms of their staff and their teams, like truly understanding like, you know, how to perform a calibration is one thing, right? That's typically, you can follow the instructions, you can do that. But understanding why it needs to be done, understanding what this equipment needs to do, is that, do you think, that's something that's really important for shops to like understand?
100% it is. Understanding why these procedures are being performed and why there's such an emphasis on this. Even when we get down to, on Honda's position statement, right, where they have, if a door intrusion beam is damaged, then you've got to calibrate the front radar and the windshield camera, right? What does that mean? Why are we doing that? And it has to do with the transfer of energy through the vehicle and how it affects those components and can cause them to shift. So even something like that, the understanding of why calibrations are necessary, the industry is starting to catch up, and that's encouraging. And I'll give an example. When we first got into this industry, the fight that we were having with the carriers was, why are pre and post scans required?
Hmm.
That was the original fight that we had.
Mhm.
And then we got to ADOS and we started providing documentation, and it was like a five-alarm fire. They were like, what are you talking about? A radar calibration? What?
Right.
That's not a thing.
Right.
And now obviously we've evolved to the point where some carriers are requiring and telling you, here's all the calibrations you must perform in this vehicle before it gets released to the customer. So those are some of the evolutions that I've witnessed in the industry, all the way from, we're not paying you to do a pre and post scan, all the way down to, now here's a list of every single thing you need to do on this car. So I hate saying that, shops aren't doing a good job. It's difficult, and I don't think it's something where there's an easy and clean resource where somebody can go to and they're just, not willing to spend the time or the effort. It's a complex industry, and things are constantly evolving. And I have the benefit of working in this industry full time and being exposed to all these different vehicles through our service business and the training that we do. I'm one of the fortunate ones that I'm exposed to this and living within this portion of the industry 40 to 60 hours or more a week. For a collision center, you have to run your collision business too, right?
Yeah.
And that's where I think it's really important to find partners, whether it's us or someone else, that can help you keep pulse on the industry as it's changing and be equipped to work on these systems and do them correctly and safely.
Yeah.
That's really the biggest thing, because we know there's a lot of liability attached to these systems, and you want to make sure not only is it done right, but that also you have the documentation to support it was done correctly.
Yeah. I think that's the monumental challenge at this particular point, is just allowing shops to know and understand there are resources like yourself out there that, from a training point, obviously from you having a unique lens to both the service side by performing sublet services for shops, but then also having the ability to say, we can come in and help you guys with equipment decisions on the ADOS side, and then uh, not necessarily just land it on a pallet in the corner of the shop and have it get set up at some point down the road. I mean, you guys are pretty proactive on providing those opportunities to help the shop get prepared. But then there's also that training side that you guys provide too, where it's more of that understanding of like how to perform calibrations, what to do when things fail. And then too, from that side of like knowing why these systems and what they do. And I think that's it's hard to get all of that information into a 1 week or even a 2 week training, because I think it's kind of ongoing, right? But having that ability to have you as a support and resource sort of post transaction, I think, is something that separates you from a lot of other folks that are out there. In your vision of like where things are at as compared to, let's say we look back 2 years ago, and you talk about like the pre and the post scan being a concern for shops on, we're not going to do them because we don't think we're going to get reimbursed, to the advent of more ADAS calibrations being performed, reimbursement being a consideration or a concern from shops, to where you mentioned now, where you've got insurance companies, I wouldn't say dictating, but saying, hey, there are things here that need to be done that we need to make sure they're getting done and get done correctly. You're looking ahead a little bit, because I think 5 years is a long, long ways in this industry, and 2 years might be even a long, long ways. If you had your crystal ball, where do you see things in 24 months roughly in the industry, Darren?
I think we're getting more towards a time when understanding all of the electronic repairs that a vehicle needs and the requirements that are attached to those are becoming much more, I would say, aware. We're much more aware of it in the industry.
Mhm.
You know, it's interesting. We talk to some areas of the country, and they've got,
Excuse
just an abundance of ADAS companies in their
me.
region.
Mhm.
And then in other areas, they're not even doing pre and post scans, and calibrations
Right.
are out of the question. Um, I think we're going to start to see that fizzle out, that part of the industry that's using the, shut our eyes and hope method
Mhm.
for, ADAS and diagnostics. The industry is now shifting to a point where ADAS is now a standard part of the repair. I think for many years in transition, if you were doing ADAS and you were documenting, you were, I would say, ahead of where the rest of the industry was. We're getting to a point now, and especially within the next 24 months, where it's going to be a requirement that you perform these calibrations and that you document and show that they were performed correctly. I really think that is where it's headed. Um, for so long, so many people have referred to it as the Wild West, and that's
Yeah.
probably correct. I think the other thing we're going to start seeing eventually is more stringent regulations on how ADAS calibrations and diagnostics are performed. And I think everybody hates the word regulation, but I think we do need some set of standards to show that a vehicle was repaired safely. I was thinking about this the other day. To cut someone's hair for a business, right? You need a license. You need a license to cut hair. And right now in our industry, you can go get a few $1,000 tablet and go calibrate systems on a vehicle that control someone's destiny while they're driving.
Does that give you concern?
Yeah, I think it concerns a lot of people in the industry. The way that I've always approached repairing vehicles is that I want that vehicle to be safe enough to where I would be comfortable putting my mom in that vehicle or my grandmother in that vehicle, and that it would protect her if she got into a driving situation where those systems needed to function.
Right.
So I think we've seen a lot in the industry, a lot of nightmare scenarios where people have done ADOS the wrong way, or they're using equipment that's maybe subpar and not to OE standard, or even to a reasonable standard, I would say in some instances. And that's always been a concern for me. I've always held the perspective that I never want to have a vehicle where when I shut my eyes at night, I think about it and go, man, I really hope that that doesn't become a problem. Right. And
Yeah.
I'm very happy that when I shut my eyes at night, I don't have any vehicle that I've ever worked on where I'm concerned about the quality of work that I've done on it. And I think that's where we need to get our industry to. Because at the end of the day, even if it's the last day of the month and this car has to go and it's had back order parts for 3 months and they're out of rental and the customer has to have the vehicle, we can't be releasing these things out into the wild, repaired improperly. Because even if that customer wants to refuse all of those services on it, and they go to a car lot the next day and sell it, and then a new family buys it, and then they get into the collision, there's so many cascading effects that we sometimes as an industry don't think about to what happens if we skip this step of the repair process, because it is a part of the repair process. And it's not something that we can just shut our eyes to, or there's no light on the dash, send it. We cannot be in that mindset anymore. It's been proven time and again that this is absolutely required and it's something that needs to be done properly.
Yeah. I think when we start talking about regulation, legislation, or I don't want to say government influence, but when they start to hover around sort of some of the things that have happened within the industry, I think they only do that when it becomes necessary for them to like start thinking about how they're going to influence that particular industry. And in this case, obviously, it's from a safety standpoint. I myself am not a big fan of it, but I think if it brings more light to folks truly understanding what's right, what's wrong, which is a wide chasm, right? Because you've been on similar social channels that I've been on, and we've seen things where people are doing things incorrectly, and they're actually thinking they're doing things right and saying, "Hey, look what we just did."
Yeah, I've I've got a couple of friends in the industry that every once in a while, when they see something that doesn't look quite right to them, they'll snap a picture and send it to me.
Yeah,
And I've gotten pictures of people outside gravel parking lot with literal like 2x4s wing nutted together with targets that they've printed
yeah.
slapped to it. And that's how they're doing calibrations. And you shake your head and just go, they think that they're doing the right thing because they're doing the calibration after they've put, the windshield or whatever, system that they're working on that requires it. And they feel like they're doing the right thing because this is required by the manufacturer. And I would argue in some cases with the way that they're calibrating it, it might even be more unsafe than if we had just replaced the windshield, just put the original camera back in, not touched it,
Yeah.
right? Obviously, we would never do that. But to your point, it is scary. And I think the other part of it that's scary is some of these systems have more tolerance than others. And if you set it up the wrong way and you get that calibration successful screen, all that means is that the camera has recognized that target and it feels that it is within the parameters that it is looking for. It does not necessarily mean that that target was set up exactly where it was supposed to per manufacturer spec.
Yeah.
So,
I'm glad you brought that up because that was one of the things I wanted to talk about is there's a difference between successful calibration and what's actually a successful safe calibration. And I'm glad you brought that up because that's something I hear all the time. Hey, well, it passed, right? I mean, that's the overarching answer. Or tell me where in the OEM document says I can't do it outside, or tell me where it says I can't hang it up target board on a chain link fence. As far as they're concerned, if it's meeting those height requirements or distance requirements, everything else is going to fall in line at checks. And it's just like, at the end of the day, would you actually put yourself back in that car yourself if it was your own? And that's where the conversation typically seems to stop. So, how do you think, like, we know education's a big piece of all of this, right? And there's a lot of things that you do and a lot of things that I do and a lot of things that other groups do to try to like, harness all of these folks in to say, hey, look, there's no more need to have an excuse or reason to have an excuse because of all of these resources that are available to folks to say, look, I get it. We work a lot of hours. We're focused on what we're trying to do on day to day. And if I have to take extra time out of my schedule at night or during the weekend to try to learn these things, especially when I already think I'm doing things correctly, then it's like a catch 22. Is there a way you think we can get to a point outside of like not having to pass, a licensure program, which there is considerations right now in Maryland, right? And additional legislation or regulation that forces folks maybe into bottlenecks that they don't necessarily want to have. Any ideas like how we can reach these folks on a little bit better way to say, hey, look, it's not that we're trying to curb your ambition. We just want to make sure you're not doing things right, and this is what's missing at this particular point.
Yeah, I'm with you, Joel. And I think, to be quite candid, that if the industry goes towards regulations on some of these systems and repairs, that some of these independent operators that are sort of in the sunset of their career are just going to say, okay, that's it. We're closing the doors
Right.
on it.
Yeah, that's a
And,
good point.
I hate to see that. My family was an independent, body shop for many years. And I love working with independent repair centers. And I hate to see them close. It's to me, it's like the lifeblood of America, right?
Right.
It's those hardworking individuals that have built a business that's trusted in the community, and they're trying to do things the right way. And so, to your point, we have to find a way that for a shop like that, it's not a task that's impossible, and it's going to be the reason why they're going to shut the doors. But we need to give them resources and help pull them up with the rest of the industry and give them resources to say, look, you don't have to be an expert in this. And so there's a couple different ways that can happen, right? If you're a really small store and you have absolutely no desire to get into these more complex ADOS repairs, find a sublet company you can trust, right? There are a lot of them across the country. I talk to people all over the country all the time that have respectable businesses that if I was a collision shop, I would absolutely use them. They do things by the book, they document it, they provide you everything you need to get paid. Those are the type of businesses, if you're an independent that does not want to deal with this side of the repair, sublet a trusted contractor. Now, if you're a store that either is larger, it's not making sense for you to sublet it anymore. Or if you're intrigued by this, you want to have this capability, you want to be able to do this in-house. That's where, like you said, doing some research initially, getting in touch with someone like us or another organization that can help walk you through the process of not only getting the right tooling, but then also the training behind that tooling. And you had mentioned that this industry is so much more than just a one-stop solution. It's not a tool that you just plug in to the OBD and it's got everything you need under the sun and it's just going to do everything for you. That's just not the case.
Yeah.
And one of the other things you mentioned is that our industry is easy until it's not. If you take the manufacturer requirements, you set up the target at the, correct distances that it's asking for, and you run the calibration routine within that module, and it passes successfully. Most people, probably 99% of people can do that. The complexities come when that doesn't work. And now we've got to figure out, okay, we've got maybe a physical alignment issue with the sensor on this vehicle, or even worse, some people's nightmare is when we've got electronic issues with modules or software or wiring. And that's where I think our industry can get a little scared sometimes, is it can be easy, but then it can also be very complicated. And I think sometimes those more complex repairs can scare organizations from wanting to get involved in it and thinking about those, nightmare situations of a vehicle that they can't get to calibrate or they can't diagnose, and what are we going to do with it?
Do you think the OEMs actually understand what's going on sort of behind the curtain with shops? Like they understand, you think they're at least aware of it?
I think so. The other thing that we have to remember is probably the majority of ADAS calibrations that are being performed are not being performed at a dealer level, right? So most shops are either doing ADAS in-house or they're using a sublet company. Now, dealership collision centers, they're probably subletting some of their ADAS. We've heard of some other shops that sublet all their ADAS to dealerships. But for the most part, it's going on, sort of behind closed doors in our industry. So I think they're aware of it. Obviously, there's been multiple conversations within our industry and events that have happened within our industry that have put a spotlight on ADAS. So I think they're aware of it, but with the complexities of automotive as a whole, I don't know if it's a top priority for them. I'm just speculating. I have no idea.
Yeah.
But it's also a problem that's very hard to solve. This is not something that we're looking from the outside in and going, oh, here's an easy solution for everybody in the industry. Someone would have already done that if that was the case.
Right.
So I think they are aware. To what degree they're aware and understand it, I can only, look from the outside in. But it has to be on their radar.
Couple of thoughts that come to mind as you kind of talk through some of this stuff, and one is the language that some of the OEMs use, and we touched on this a little bit as far as that gray area. You talk about like when involved in a collision. Another big concern that we hear a lot from the industry is required versus recommend, and that comes back to is that language that the OEMs use as sort of a CYA, right? Is it just enough for them to like sort of manifest their destiny to say, hey, look, we've given you all the information. It's a matter of what you do at this particular point. And they're not as much concerned about reimbursement because they're providing that documentation through either through themselves or through a data aggregator like All Data Repair Logic. I guess my question is, in an instance where required versus recommend or that gray area comes in, like what's typically your best practice as far as like how your service company operates in those situations?
Yeah, I mean, for our service company, it's very, very clear. If it is recommended, suggested, what even the loosest of a recommendation from a manufacturer, we're going to perform it. And that's the stance we've always taken. We've made partnerships with stores for, almost a decade now with ADAS and diagnostics. And that's one of the things we told them from the jump is if it's unclear as to what the requirement is, we're going to perform it, And if you don't get reimbursed, we'll eat the cost of that.
Mhm.
But we're going to make sure that when that vehicle goes home, that it's been repaired correctly.
Has that helped your business, you think,
Oh,
by
massively.
having that stance?
Yeah, massively. When you go to someone like a body shop operator, at the end of the day, the carrier can tell you what they're going to pay for a repair. They can, have an adjuster review the estimate. But at the end of the day, the collision center is liable for that vehicle.
Right.
When it leaves, the adjuster that signs off on it from the insurance carrier and the estimator at the collision center that signs off on it and sends the vehicle home, they are both liable, at least in the state of North Carolina, they are, for how that vehicle was repaired. Because the shop, in the eyes of the law, is the expert in repairing that vehicle to factory standards. So to go in and tell an organization, we're going to do the right thing, even if we don't get paid for part of it, because they understand that they're on the hook for that repair and that vehicle for life until it goes to the scrapyard, that's been a massive help to our business.
Yeah, I can only imagine. I hope for people that are out there listening that are maybe running their own sublet or they're considering setting up some sort of sublet service. I think our same philosophy we had at Precision Diagnostics. Like, look, if it's something that needs to be done, we're going to do it. If you don't get paid for it, we're not going to bill you for it. It's just good business practice. And I think a lot of people struggle with, well, we're doing work, we should get paid for it. I agree. But also, if you think you're not going to get paid for it and taking the stance of like not doing that work, putting people at risk uh, because of the fact that money is important. Obviously, it helps with running the day to day and it operationalizes us. But at the same time, too, I think we also have to understand putting people back into safe vehicles because of the fact that we don't think we're going to get a $3 or $4 reimbursement. It's foolish, quite honestly. So,
Yeah.
I would say I commend you guys on that effort. Having that stance that you guys have had for so long says that early on you guys recognized this is just good business practice for us. So,
And, realistically, Joel, like you said, in the grand scheme of things, it's really not costing you that much. When you look at how many repairs are done that you don't get reimbursed on, it's a drop in the bucket, at least for us it is, on operations that we perform and don't get reimbursed for.
yeah,
And I think part of that is that we have conversations with carriers and adjusters in the field. And I feel for them because I think what sometimes shops don't understand, and especially, AOS technicians in the industry, all they hear from a shop perspective is this carrier denied this. And I think if people understood the amount of pressure that even just adjusters in the industry are under for, keeping severity and these other, parts of these repairs down, it's massive. And, you know, part of that is our fault
yeah,
because we've had parts of the industry that, especially in the early days, massively took advantage of carriers.
yeah,
And in my opinion, way, way overbilled for services. And that is what I think caused this knee-jerk reaction from a lot of carriers to say, they think, some of them think the industry is a scam. And to be fair, part of the industry kind of was a scam as far as billing goes there for a while.
yeah.
So I think when you understand the mechanics behind how some of these things have happened, it it brings it into perspective. And some of these claims that I've dealt with, we have an adjuster or an estimator that comes to us and says, we don't think this is required. I remember I was in Burlington, North Carolina, and I had an adjuster come to me on a Toyota RAV4 that they were sectioning the rear body and quarter panel that the blind spot mounts to. And they're like, why do you want to calibrate the blind spot? We're reconstructing the part of the vehicle that the blind spot gets mounted to.
Right.
So, yeah, that, educating the industry on why we're doing what we're doing. This comes back to the same thing we talked about earlier. When you show them the importance of what you're doing and what it actually affects, the opinion that adjuster had was, well, we're not replacing the sensor, which we did wind up replacing it. But
Yeah.
his position at that point was, we're just putting the same sensor back on. It doesn't need to be programmed.
Right.
But having conversations and showing them, here's the documentation, here's how the system works. Some of them are just going to, tell you to kick rocks, right?
Right.
Some of them are just not going to give you the time of day, and that's going to be an operation that you're going to have to eat. But some of them will listen, And when you take time out of your day to try and help them understand your perspective and how you're trying to repair vehicles correctly, and that you want the vehicle to go home safe just like they want the vehicle to go home safe, when you can build that rapport and build that relationship with them, that's only going to make your life easier. If you go down the warpath of just trying to trash adjusters and trash insurance companies, I've seen that route play out. It's not the route that we take. I've never seen it end well. We have to work together as an industry to come to a middle ground.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, the carriers need the collision centers to fix the vehicles for their policyholders. Sublet ADAS calibration companies need the shops to have the work for them to survive also. It's a symbiotic relationship. We all need each other to be successful in this industry. And instead of us trying to wage war, let's find a way that we can be reasonable. Both sides are going to have to make concessions on certain things. That's how negotiations work. But you can get to a point where you found a middle ground and you found a path forward that works for everyone.
Yeah, being able to have that sort of that context of like, hey, it makes sense for us to, I don't want to say partner with the insurance companies because I think that's a negative connotation in our industry, but it's having that ability to have the dialogue with them because there are some that you're right that they want to go against the grain no matter what, and then there are some that are certainly willing to be educated, willing to learn, make their life easier, right? I mean, they're dealing with a mountain of files on a daily basis, and they're trying to push those through as much as they can. I'm curious, like, what was your guys' approach? I know you mentioned this about as far as having some conversations with insurance companies. It's like sort of a two-part question. Like, what was your approach to kind of get their interest in like, hey, let's sit down and have a conversation? And what have been some of the benefits? I know you mentioned a few here already, but what are some of the benefits that you guys saw as far as um, maybe not seeing as much pushback, or maybe them just flagging certain concerns and saying, hey, we just need some more information here. And because of that initial conversation with them, helping sort of get to that particular point where is that positive level of dialogue.
Sure. So let's address the first part of that. So, to your point, one of the biggest ways that I built relationships with carriers in the industry was especially early on when we were putting front radar calibrations on collision repairs. And this was, the first time some of these adjusters had ever seen that
Yeah.
on a repair.
What
They
is
wanted
this?
documentation of every single thing Toyota or whoever else had on that. So that was definitely a way to open a door. And the other thing we did was we showed them our equipment. We brought them into our facility and we said, look, we don't want to be behind the curtain. We want to be transparent and show you here's what we're doing. This is not we just hook up a tablet, click a button, and bill you $400.
Right.
This is the procedure that we follow. These are the measurements that we make. These are the standards that we follow that are set by the manufacturer to repair the electronic parts of this vehicle. And we show them the amount of work that goes into it. I think that's part of it. The other part of it is just the documentation, just showing this is a requirement from the manufacturer to do this. And if we don't do this, then we're going to be in a bad way with the liability attached to this car. Um, my business partner, Cliff, he was in the airbag industry when that first came out 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
And so he had the same fight with the carriers when airbags came out.
Yeah.
And, he was part of the push against when they wanted to start using used airbag components in vehicles, which is something we're starting to see in the ADAS industry now. He went through all those fights with them, and so he still has a lot of those guys are still in the insurance industry and he still has those connections. So that, I can't lie, that has really helped us a lot. But even from my perspective, where I'm building my own relationships with those carriers, being a resource, one of the other things we've done is we told them, hey, we don't just work on vehicles, we diagnose them also.
Yeah.
So if you've got a vehicle that's at another shop and, another sublet company can't get it to calibrate, the dealer can't get it to calibrate or program, whatever it is, let us know. We'll help you out. And that's really built a lot of rapport with certain carriers for us. When they've got a vehicle that either a dealership can't figure it out or another sublet company is struggling with it, they send it over to us. We get that vehicle taken care of for them, and we've saved a couple vehicles that were getting to a point where the estimated repairs were going to total the claim after it had been repaired by collision, which is a nightmare for a carrier.
Right.
And we were able to save them that process and repair the vehicle correctly and find what really is the root cause of this. That can really, really help with building the relationships with the carrier, is remembering it's not a one-way street. You need to help them just like they help you.
Yeah. A lot of times too, I think they don't realize necessarily the complexity of like why certain components need recalibration. And they're drivers, right? They've got families, they operate vehicles, they're out on the road. They want to make sure that the car that's across the intersection from them as it approaches them is just as safe as it should be. So I think when you kind of enlighten them to that particular point, they truly understand it. Um, I want to kind of refocus back here on sort of the initial, content of this, which was on the sort of the OEM side. One of the things that we recently pulled out of the ADAS community was kind of looking back through peer-to-peer requests on asking for help or support on specific vehicles from different OEMs. And one of the ones that keeps kind of bubbling back up to the top, probably more frequently than normal, and you're probably not going to be surprised by this, is Toyota. Um, Curious your thoughts, and maybe this has been in your experience, or maybe it hasn't been. I'd be really curious to hear that too. But we kept seeing like Nissan periodically, we'd see Honda every once in a while. I'm not saying any specifics as far as like what the support requests were for, but then it would be almost on a weekly basis, we would see a request on a Toyota vehicle from within the community on somebody looking for help or support. Toyotas are typically, um, there's brand loyalty there. Cars are safe, they're dependable, on and on and on. But yet, when it comes from sort of this non-collision repair side, they seem to throw up a lot of issues. Any insight to that at all?
So I think that anybody who's been in the ADAS space for a number of years probably already knows this. Some of those who are new to the industry may not. A few years back, Toyota massively changed retroactively their service information. And there were a lot of vehicles for Toyota and Lexus for a number of years. I mean, sometimes over a decade in some cases, where the position was if you remove a front bumper or a rear bumper, the sensors behind those bumper covers must be calibrated. And that was retroactively changed to something along the lines of if the bumper cover is damaged, if where the bumper cover mounts to the vehicle is damaged, something along those lines, that is when the calibration is required. So that I think for a lot of people, if they weren't pulling OE service information every time a vehicle came through the door on what the requirements were, I think there were some organizations that got caught with their pants down, so to speak,
Yeah.
where the information and the document they've been using for the last 5 to 7 years now is completely different.
Yeah.
And when the carrier came back to them and said, that's not what that document says anymore, and they pulled it up in TIS, it was, oh, this is different and this claim does not qualify anymore. So that I think that's part of it, is that service information can change. And like Toyota, especially when you go into the TIS, you can see at the top, it'll tell you the last time that particular service document was revised, and you will be able to see that. So I think that's a big part of it, Joel.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting when you look at sort of the requests out on different social feeds or Reddit or again even in the community. It just seems like it's uh, Toyota, Toyota, Toyota quite often, and that makes complete sense though. So good rule of thumb: make sure you're subscribing to information that provides like updated position statements, service bulletins. Obviously, subscribing to the Toyota software can certainly help keeping that subscription up to date, things like that. Which brings me back to something that I mentioned kind of at the top of the, the podcast here was your development of a laptop that you've got pretty much every OEM on this laptop. And love to hear why you put this together, what it can do, and sort of a plug for, how folks could potentially get their hands on this and what benefits it can provide for them.
Yeah, absolutely. So I love telling this story. This product is really what allowed our service business to grow and flourish in the way that it did. right before COVID happened, so this was 2019 era, maybe a little bit before that even, we got approached by an organization that wanted us to do a large contract for them. And one of their stipulations was that we were required to use OEM tools to perform all of the scans for that organization. Um, Anybody who's been on the programming side of this industry for any amount of time knows that typically means you're going to have 10 to 12
Yeah.
laptops per location
Yep.
with all that different software loaded on each one of them.
Yep.
And with my background in technology, I looked at that and there just has to be a better way to do this. So I spent about 18 months engineering a platform that would allow us to take all of the manufacturer's OEM software, not modify it in any way, and put it onto one device. So that way you could have one physical device for a laptop to run all the different manufacturers' software. And that was a game changer for us because now, even if you bought mid-tier laptops, right, let's call them 800 bucks a piece, and you got to buy eight of them. Wow,
Yeah.
that gets expensive
Yeah.
fast.
Yeah.
It
Right.
gets really expensive. So now you can have one laptop that is a very high spec machine. It's rugged. It's built to be in a workspace all day, and that was huge for our business because now when we had a technician go to a store, if they had to program something, if they needed to diagnose something, they had a resource where we were prepared for those operations. It wasn't, let's go back to the shop down the road and grab this laptop and oh crap, it isn't charged and where's the interface at? We eliminated all of those issues and it gave us a much more concise solution to be prepared for vehicles that we didn't even commonly see. One of the vehicle brands that we don't see super often is Volvo, right?
Yeah.
We don't work on a ton of them, and we especially don't work on a ton of them that have modules replaced. But now we had a resource where if somebody had a Volvo with new headlamps in it and we needed to program it, within 15, 20 minutes, we were ready to program. And that is that is the part of our business that helped us succeed the most, in my opinion.
Yeah. The I mean, it's again, what's one laptop. It's a is it a tough book, I believe.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a Dell Rugged, so we're
Yeah.
Dell
Okay.
authorized
Yeah.
distributors, and so they're Dell Rugged platforms. They're great.
How do
And
the updates work as far as like, are you guys maintaining that or is that on the customer themselves?
yeah, so we absolutely offer that. So that's a paid plan that someone can add to the service. For some stores, they've been using the software for so long, they're familiar with it. They just want to update it
Yeah.
themselves. We have absolutely no issue with that. For other organizations, either they don't want to spend the time on it or they just maybe don't have someone on staff with the specialty to do that. And so that is one of the services we offer is not only will we sell you the device, but if you want us to keep you up to date on all of your manufacturer software, we will remote in and keep every single program on that laptop up to date for you.
Yeah. And I think I mean, this could be the path for a lot of shops or even sublet companies for that matter, as far as when they run into issues, they're trying to program something with their current aftermarket tool set where, as you know, there are limitations, right? Because that information isn't necessarily released or launched or updated out to the aftermarket until, right, who knows when, right? So then, whereas this, you've got the most up-to-date information right at your fingertips, basically, and there's no issues, there's no gaps, there's no fumbling around with 8, 10, 12 different laptops at that particular point. Again, I came from a company that we had, our mobile techs had 4 or 5 laptops, and they were partitioned with as much as we could get on those things. And it was, I don't want to call it a nightmare, but it was a struggle. I mean, we literally had one person that their job was to
Yep.
help organize and, from an operational standpoint, manage all of these laptops and everything. So if you're out there and you're listening, I would certainly recommend taking a look at uh, uh, what Darren put together and you can find that with the national website, I believe.
Yeah, so if you go to National CDS, so Charlie Delta Sierra, .com, that'll bring you right to our site. And under scan tools, we've got the 360 OEM laptop. That's what we call it. And one of the things I want to mention, Joel,
Yeah.
that I think it's overlooked so often in the industry is I think part of the reason why shops don't buy more OEM tools in some circumstances and start, turning away work or sending it to the dealer is you go on Google and you put in Ford OEM tool, and the first thing that pops up is here's a full package for $5,000.
Yeah.
And that's great if all you work on all day long is Fords. Like that's the package you want.
Right.
But the problem is when you work on a few Fords a year and there's certain things you can't do without that software, it's hard to spend 5 grand on that, especially when that is the only thing it does. And then you go online and you look at Toyota and you're like, man, that's another 3, 4 grand just for one manufacturer.
Right.
One of the things that this product allows you to do is short-term licensing. So because we have the ability to run all these programs on this device, we've killed the whole I need to go buy another computer just to run this part, or the I don't know if I need to go buy another computer to run this, and if I install it and it screws up everything else, then I'm really, up a creek without a paddle. We've eliminated that. And in my opinion, it makes having OEM software within your store so much more cost effective.
Yeah.
You have the entry level price of here's the laptop and the interface device that I'm going to buy. And then we keep it as up to date as we can, a menu of here's every single manufacturer that you can have loaded on here. And here is the different licensing lengths that they offer. And here's how much they cost. And so, for example, Nissan, let's say you have a Nissan vehicle that rolls in, it's a Nissan Aria, you're required to use Consult 4 for programming or calibration or diagnostics. To license Consult 4 for one day on that laptop is $50.
Yeah.
That's a lot more affordable than looking up Nissan 1 year subscription, and just a subscription is $38.75.
Right.
I mean,
That's
if
great. Yeah.
if you only need it for one vehicle, there's no way that you're going to buy that. So that's one of the things that I want to get awareness about out into the industry is that aftermarket tools are phenomenal. They've helped our industry grow in a way that I can't even, put a number on. We're authorized distributors for Auto. We're master diagnostic and ADOS distributors. We have a great relationship with Auto. But no tool in the world has 100% capabilities for every vehicle.
Right.
It's just not possible.
Yeah.
And things break every day. Heck, manufacturer servers go down and sometimes you can't use their tool for the tank, right? So there's nothing out there that's
Also
perfect.
an opportune time.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And so that's just what I want to get out there to people is that when you search up an OEM tool, the price that you see may not always be what you would have to pay, right? There's solutions out there like this laptop where we can put you together a hardware package that when the time comes and you need a manufacturer that you don't work on that often, it might be, between 50 to $200 for that day to license that. You can probably pass that cost along to the customer. But the capabilities that it adds for you, not only do you now have access to that OEM software, but you also have access to our support. So let's say you've got a vehicle, you've never worked on it, you need to program something on it, you don't even know how to program on this software. Okay, great. We'll get you hooked up with the software. It's on an account that's for your store, licensed in your name. You completely own it, and we will help you. We'll help you work on it. We'll remote right in. It's like we're sitting right in front of the laptop with you. I can't tell you how many wiring diagrams I've pulled and wiring harnesses I've diagnosed as bad, or modules that are bad, or programmed remotely with this system. We had a BMW X5M competition, and it took us weeks to finally get every single thing worked out on this thing. But we did that for a customer remotely, and it was one that they just refused to send to the dealer, and we got everything back and functional on that car. And that was a bear. But I think that truly tested our capabilities as not only a hardware and software provider, but also as remote support. Um, that's what we're here for. I want to help other people be successful in this industry. That's the entire reason why we started National.
Yeah.
Is we want to be a resource for the industry from cradle to grave. And what I mean by that is we try to brand everything that we have as the NCDS 360 solution. And so when a customer comes to me, I want to meet them where they're at. So if you're someone that has no experience in the industry, I want to do an evaluation with you on what's the revenue model look like for you? What's your ROI? What vehicles are you working on? So we know that you have all the tools that you need to work on them successfully. And then what training do you need so that we can make sure that the investment you're making is going to pay off for you and pay dividends into your business for your hard work and for your investment.
Yeah.
Or if you're someone that's been in this industry for a long time and you're growing and scaling and you're running into issues, whether it be OEM software or hardware or training, whatever that may be, we want to meet you there. So that's really the biggest thing that I preach about our business model is that we're here to provide solutions. We're not just here to sell you a tool.
Yeah.
If that's what you want, something transactional, you just want to buy a tool, we happen to sell it, great. I have no problem with that. But for the most part, the first conversation I have with someone is the beginning of a relationship that has no end date on.
Bring up a really good point. It's actually a good segue and kind of like what I wanted to kind of bring us out on this as far as this goes is that there are a lot of shops that are actively investigating uh, tools, equipment to do their own ADOS in-house. There's a lot of thought going on, thought panels, there are thought leadership, industry panels. I was on one this weekend at the Northeast show that the specific topic was, what considerations do shops need to make as far as in-house versus sublet or maybe a hybrid model. When you guys come in through NCDS and you're talking to a shop and trying to consider like what they should do to start with equipment, what variables do you typically look at? What questions do you typically ask? What things are important to you to make sure that, because I know it's important to you not to oversell them. You don't want to get them into equipment that they're never probably going to use or don't have the space or environment to do it. What things are you typically asking the shop? Like, what consideration should shop make? Because it's going to continue to grow and flourish, right? There's going to be more shop investigation or curiosity on like, hey, we've got a good relationship with a sublet, but we think there's some things that we can do here to kind of control our own destiny. Like, what does that typically look like for you guys, Darren?
Yeah, Joel, and I think you hit the nail on the head there. Really, for me, when I get on an initial call with someone, I'm just there to listen. I want to hear what are they doing right now?
Yep.
What are the pain points that they're experiencing? And where are they trying to wind up at? And if they don't know, we can help guide them through that process. But I think that's where we get lost in the industry sometimes, is that we feel like we've got such a great solution and we just can't wait to tell somebody about it. I want to know what about your business you need help with. And is it that you want to do it on your own, but you have concerns because you have OEM certifications, or maybe you didn't even think about that until this conversation that I've got OEM certifications that if I bring all these operations in house, I need to make sure I'm following the letter of the law with the manufacturers I've signed contracts with. Or it's, I've grown to such a size that bringing this in-house makes sense from a revenue perspective or a cycle time perspective with, they're currently using a sublet. What does that look like? And how do we build a program that's really tailored to them? I can honestly say that there's never been two stores that I looked at them and they had, the exact same
Right.
action plan for here's how we help them.
Right.
Right. Every situation is different. And that's where I feel we provide a lot of value to stores is yes, we're distributors, but we're distributors that are still running active service businesses in this industry. We're in the industry, and candidly, the reason why we started national is ProMobile Scan and Advanced Targeting Solutions in North Carolina, and we're doing very well. I didn't want to have to try and manage employees in 50 different states.
Right.
That was the reason why we didn't just keep growing all over the country. So national was started so that we could take everything that we had learned and been successful with on both diagnostics and calibrations and help other organizations not in competing territories be successful with bringing ADOS in-house or starting a sublet company to perform ADOS calibrations. I think that's really where our expertise shines, is that I'm in it to help an organization scale and grow. And there have been organizations that I've looked at and I've shown them the numbers and I've said, I don't think this makes sense at this time for you
Yeah.
from a revenue standpoint.
Yeah, that's an
Let's
interesting.
try and find you maybe a sublet provider. But we always try to be transparent.
Yeah. I have to imagine knowing the equipment costs. I mean, we've done some surveys with our customer groups, and I've kind of come from that side of the industry too, and I know what the equipment can look like in terms of, if you do go full scale. I imagine that number jumps off the page pretty quick when they're considering certain aftermarket products that are, without getting into the specifics, but like an IE 1000. I mean, it's not cheap by any stretch.
Yeah, I don't think there's any product in the industry that's trying to be all things to all people,
Right.
right? You know, there are different products for different product segments. Just like when you go to buy a vehicle, buying a, Hyundai Elantra is not the same as going and buying a brand new BMW M5,
Right.
right? We're looking at different sides of the industry, and just to use the Auto example you brought up, the i700 is a great way to start in the industry.
Yeah.
It's portable. You have the camera-based setup on it still. They have a massive promotion on it right now. It's the most affordable way right now to have a camera-based system and get into the industry the right way, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So, but you make a great point. The other thing you have to think about is what industry can you invest? Let's say even the investment is $100,000 and you finance it. What industry can you get in where that's your startup cost with the ability to generate, high 6 to 7 figures in revenue?
Yeah.
I mean, it's very far and few. So most of the customers that we see, I don't think I've seen any of them that have not paid off their equipment costs or had the ability to pay off their equipment costs within the first 6 to 12 months.
That's crazy.
Pretty much all
Yeah.
of them before the 6 month
Yeah.
mark. So that's what we have to remember is if you're going to be in the industry, you have to have the right tools. It's the same thing as being a mechanic or a body technician. You can't just show up with your lunch pail and expect the money to fall out of the sky, right? You've got to invest into yourself. And the other thing you have to think about is your opportunity cost, right? In some cases, depending on what system you buy, system A takes you 30 to 45 minutes to set up, and system B takes you 15 minutes to set up. What's your opportunity cost using system A? And you might start with system A and upgrade to system B in the future. But my point is, you've got to look realistically at what your workflow is for collision centers that are looking to bring revenue in-house. You have a lot of data points that you can look at. How much did we sublet last year? What's our RO count? What is our severity? What kind of vehicles are we working on? That gives you a ton of data to understand what that revenue model looks like. And also, what does your workflow look like? If you need to calibrate 8 to 10 vehicles a day, we probably shouldn't use a system that requires all manual measurements.
Right.
I'm just going to throw that out there, right? Looking at a camera-based system, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So it's all relative, but I mean, you buy once, cry once, right? In some cases.
Right.
Yes, it can be a lot to invest, but as a revenue generating asset, that's the side of the story that needs to be told is
Yeah.
something to me. I think the definition of something that is expensive is you do not get the value out of it that is in correlation to the price that you paid. That is when something is expensive, right? Something may have a high price, the volume of money that you spend on it may be high, but if you get out of that 10, 15, 100x of what you put into it, you're not going to call it expensive.
And I think, again, shops have got to be realistic, as far as what their expectations are. They have to be realistic that a hybrid approach of doing as much as they can in-house, if that's their ultimate goal. There's still going to be times where they're going to have to sublet. They're still going to have to be dependent on somebody else sometimes to help with certain vehicles because of limitations of equipment, staff, software, what have you. So I think that's, for my own opinion, I mean, I think it's a really good approach. And and again, I think if you're in a metro area across the country, there's a lot of good sublet companies out there.
Oh
I
yeah.
think if you're in a rural area, a rural market, smaller, less access to the sublet, if your nearest dealership might be 50, 60 miles away, and there's a lot of considerations as far as costs of getting that car to and from that dealership alone, and who knows when you get it back, right? I mean, I think those are independently good opportunities for folks to investigate. Let's really sit down and let's think about what's our mix of vehicles. what are these typically from these vehicles, what do we typically see for calibrations? Do we have considerations as far as environment or space, or is there something across the street that we could rent or lease and we could retrofit to be a, calibration specific environment, or a lot of different things that I think shops are kind of thinking about some of those things now. There's a lot more that actually are thinking of it and they're actually implementing it as we speak or already have. But then there's a massive influx of shops at this particular point that, um, again, kind of going back to that, hey, we want to just make sure we're pre-scanning every vehicle and getting to that point. So again, I think when we reflect back on where things land in 2 years, like we talked about before, that's probably the audience at this particular point. Couple things I want to get you out of here on because we're well into this, and this has been a phenomenal conversation. So I certainly appreciate it. But um, two questions we'll get you out of here on. What advice would you give to your younger self if you could?
The biggest thing that I've learned in this industry is that you never know everything. It is constantly evolving. And just when you think that started to master a lot of the aspects of the industry, something changes.
Yeah,
And so the illustration that I like to use with people is you know just little enough to not realize how much you don't know.
yeah,
And so that's where you can catch yourself. And I remember sort of that breakthrough moment for me where I thought I knew everything there was to know about ADOS. I read the engineering documents, I was working on vehicles. The more that you learn about it, the more you realize there are so many aspects to this industry,
yeah,
and it takes a team of people that are all diligently working on it to be successful. That's the biggest thing that I've probably personally learned, and also that the hard work is worth it. Anything that's worth doing is not easy. Those are very cliche words, but we have an opportunity right now where the repair industry is changing, and this is going to be the new standard for our industry, and we can help others be successful and help shape the way this part of the industry operates.
yeah. I think that's a really good piece that just that support and that resource I think is something that's just we can't say it loud enough, quite honestly. So, but yeah, you're right. I mean, it's incredibly difficult to know everything about this industry, especially on the ADOS side, and being humble enough to say like, hey, you're continuously learning, continuing to challenge yourself, uh, lift up your team, lift up your customers, lift up everybody around you says a lot about you, obviously. So, last thing I'll get you out of here on this. If you could spend 5 minutes with every collision repair shop owner in the country, what advice would you give them?
Diagnostics and ADOS are not optional. I
Yeah,
think that a lot of the industry is becoming wise to that, but there's still a large portion of our industry that's treating it as an optional or there's no light on the dash, so we're going to send it home. The not only the liability, but the safety that you are compromising on if you do not perform these operations is huge. Not to mention you can get paid for it. Like
right.
we're not asking you to do something that you're going to lose money on. You can be profitable with this and fix the vehicle correctly. That's the biggest thing. And they're probably harsh words, but if you do not come up with a solution for how you're going to handle diagnostics and ADOS within your organization, whether you're doing it in-house or you're subletting it to a reliable company, the industry will leave you behind
Yeah.
because it is something that is no longer it can no longer be ignored.
Yep.
You are going to be required to do it, and if you do not have a solution for it, it's going to leave you by the wayside.
It's great advice. I love that. I appreciate your time today. This has been incredibly informative. I learned something new from you every time we talk, which is pretty frequent, quite honestly. Um, Again, find Darren out on nationalcds.com and his website. I know he's out on different social channels as well. He's a great advocate and resource to tap into. Again, Darren, I want to say thanks for your time today. Greatly appreciate it, and looking forward to our continued relationship and friendship and everything else that goes into that. So I appreciate it. Thank you, sir.
Likewise, thank you so much for having me,
You
Joel.
bet. Thanks, Darren.